Okay, can everybody still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
You bet.
So first off, welcome everybody and to our October SaskBIM meeting here, and thank you very much to Carl Storms for hosting this Dynamo presentation. We'll kick off as we normally do with a tip and a trick. Can you guys see my screen right now? All right, can we see now?
Yes.
Yep.
Perfect. All right. So for this month's tip and trick, it's a room calculation point in the families. So one thing, we brought this up before and we might have already addressed it, but it was refreshed for me. So when we have families that are in ceilings or in ceiling space or that are just outside of the room or the space calculation, those elements don't know the space or room that they're associated with. What we've found here is there's a room calculation point associated with every family. So if you go into your family type here, and in your properties, there's a room calculation point. You can click that on, and there it brings it down this little node. Wherever this node is in relation to your family is where it's looking for the space. So, for example, an air terminal would relay its air volume and family type into the space. Mechanical equipment would then be able to leverage the space that it's above and serving. And so often in mechanical equipment, by default, this room calculation point is kind of in the center of the equipment. That works real well if the equipment is actually in the space. But when you have ceiling mounted things like fan coils and such, it doesn't know the space associated. So you can come in here in your properties, turn on room calculation, go to an elevation view, and you can drag that room calculation point to whatever point you need it. And then, simply load it back into your project. And as soon as you do that, all of the space and room information is associated now with that family. And that was my tip for this month.
Now, if you wanted to move that across multiple families in an automated process, so to speak, I wonder if there's a way to do that.
That is a great segue. Yeah. So on that note, again, I'll welcome Carl Storms with BIM Track, and I'll send the screen back over to you, Carl, and we'll go with your presentation.
All right. Thank you. And we are PowerPoint enabled. So the idea with this presentation, we're not going to dive super deep into the complicated world of Dynamo, although it certainly doesn't have to be a complicated world. We're going to do more of a introduction, learn about all the things that have changed. For those of you that have been working with Dynamo in the past, or maybe have been to a few sessions in something like AU or Built or other CanBIM events, you may have learned, hey, this works or that works. Well, the team behind Dynamo is doing lots of things to change it. And what Dynamo used to be like just a few versions ago is quite different now. So I'm going to sort of walk through all of those things and give you some resources to help you through. So let's sort of walk down that road. So the first thing, if you go to either scan that great big QR code or go to the BIMsider website, and you'll see there's a SaskBIM 2020 link. Inside of there, I've got a copy of this PowerPoint, so all the links, so you don't need to take screenshots, although feel free. There's also in there a link to a session I did at Your Desk University earlier this year about packages, the information from that, and there's also a complete data set and exercise guide for Dynamo classes I've done at AU and Built over the last couple of years called Dynamo Everyone's Doing It. So it's over 100 pages of some exercises as well as the data sets and models for Revit 18, 19, and 20. So we won't be able to cover all that stuff in the time that we have allotted tonight, but I know everyone that comes to these things loves a little bit of weekend homework, so you're more than welcome to jump in and do that. As far as an agenda, we're going to get into introductions, which is just a silly slide talking about myself because it's always a little awkward. We'll get into sort of what Dynamo is. I like to call that Dynamo 101. We'll talk a little bit about packages that are out there and how packages can make your life easier in the world of Dynamo. And then we'll do some tips and tricks. And really the majority of the tips and tricks that we're looking at here are workflow related, how to make Dynamo work and be better organized as you work your way through. And the few things that come from that are a precursor to my AU 2020 class this year, which is called Dynamo Isn't Magic, but some of the things it does may seem magical, where there'll be a ton more tips and tricks, as well as what I like to call some all-star tips. So from some of the Dynamo experts worldwide have shared some of their favorite tips and tricks for Dynamo with me, and we'll be sharing them with that session. So that'll be something in November when that comes out. And of course, I have questions there at the end, but at any point, unfortunately, the Zoom that I have through that I have access to, the chat's disabled, so we can't put questions in the chat, but feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question anytime. You don't have to wait to the end. We'll answer it as it comes in. I'm also happy to answer them at the end. That is me, Carl Storms, currently a technical solutions lead at BIMtrack. I'm an architectural technologist by trade, but I've done a little bit of everything as you can see. Spent some time on the general contractor side, worked with residential commercial architecture, most recently before BIMtrack, working at Imagine, doing all things on the AEC side, teaching Dynamo, Navisworks, Revit, helping people do BIM implementations. And currently what I like to do when I'm not doing this is working with some podcasts. In fact, we just recorded a BIM Thoughts podcast with Tim and Hazel, who does the Yordas Universities, just before this, so it's been a busy night. But enough about me. Well, let's jump into Dynamo. So what is Dynamo? So Dynamo is essentially a visual programming language. And so what this allows you to do is essentially think of it as the Swiss Army knife of what we can do in the AEC industry with programs like Revit. And we'll also see that it's not just Revit anymore. It's an open source platform. I know Autodesk talks about it a lot, and it's an Autodesk product. I'm doing air quotes here, but it is completely open source. If you wanted to go to their GitHub page, you could get access to the code and you could help improve it. So it is completely open source. It is completely free. The idea with a lot of the workflows, as we may have heard a little bit earlier, is to help with automation, to help improve things. But that's not just what it does. Really, there's the limit to what you can do with Dynamo is what you think you need to do. It definitely works with geometry. And when it first came out, a lot of people would say that all it does is twisty towers, talking about the geometry that it does. And geometry is still a big part of it. But I think over the years, as people have used it, particularly those on the BIM management side, have found there's so much more you can do with it with getting the data, that I in BIM, the information from outside of your project, that it's become so much more than just the ability to manipulate data or geometry, as the case may be. We can talk with multiple softwares, and we'll see going in, again, not just Revit anymore. And we have the ability to do these routines. So while you don't have to be a programmer to work with Dynamo, being able to think logically certainly helps. So if you are a right brain thinker, life's going to be much easier. One of the ways that helps you sort of imagine in your mind how to use Dynamo, especially for those of you that haven't, is think about the last time you went to IKEA. So those set of instructions that you get, in this case for the Billy bookcase, this is visual programming. This is essentially it. We are given a set of instructions, and those instructions are followed. We don't have to write code. So when we're doing Dynamo, we're basically putting together a set of visual instructions without having to worry about syntax or anything like that. We're putting the information together visually. Now, there's lots of ways with which you can get started into coding, and there's lots of ways you can get started in visual programming. And one of the ones that's really cool for a number of reasons is Scratch. So Scratch is a visual programming code that was developed by MIT, and it's aimed at kids. Think of all the STEM learning that we have out there now available. And the idea is it's just like Lego blocks. You click the things together and you're able to have, in this case, we call it a Guelph, that little cat, do something on the screen. So when we click these 4 blocks together and we hit activate or run, it does something. The little cat changed color, walked 20 steps, and said something. And this allows you to start going down the road of understanding how programming, in particular visual programming, works, and start at a very young age. And where I really got into this was I could go and I could play with Scratch and I could learn things that helped me with my Dynamo journey. And if anybody says, what are you doing playing with that toy? Well, you know, I'm learning from my niece or my nephew. So you can always use your kids or your nieces and nephews to help you in a learning process, kind of like learning to play Minecraft. Just recently, well, I guess a couple years ago now, Autodesk bought Tinkercad, and they just incorporated their own visual programming language inside of Tinkercad. Again, completely free program. A lot of people use this to make content that they're going to 3D print. And it's easier, especially for repetition, if you can do it code-wise. And as you can see on the screen here, again, we're using building blocks like Lego to put that together to create that content. Probably one of the most familiar to us in the AEC, particularly the design area, is working with Grasshopper. So Grasshopper is, and I'm not going to say the original because there was one from, I can't remember the name of it now, something components from Graphisoft, even before that, that allowed you to do parametric design, which is essentially what we are using Grasshopper for. And a lot of people said that Dynamo was the Grasshopper of the Revit world. Since then, they've both gone their own ways, and even through something like Revit inside of Rhino, you now have the ability to attach Grasshopper directly into Revit, so they're no longer competing entities. They can now play nice together. And of course, we also have the ability to do generative design. So with the 2021 release of Revit, we had brought in with it generative design tools. You can sort of see up in the top corner, there's a couple of generative design tools that we see right here. And this is what it's running. And this is from the Autodesk website, this video. And it looks very nice, and generative design allows us to do a lot of iterations very quickly and then push those back into Revit. But what you don't see is that all of the back end for this is inside of Dynamo. So when you start using generative design, which I can't show you because you have to be an AEC collection member to have access to it. It doesn't come with just your regular Revit subscription. You have the ability to do this, but all the back end is inside of Dynamo. So when you get it, they give you 3 sample models. And if you want to improve or edit or work upon those, all of that happens inside of Dynamo. So having a fundamental understanding of Dynamo allows you to update, to edit, and to change these generative design options that come inside of Revit. So again, it all ties back into Dynamo. And as we see here, as we bring it back to visual programming, this is a rather simple graph that comes from working inside of Dynamo, but we need to think of it a certain way. And again, it's that logical thinking that helps us in our journey to learning Dynamo and really any coding for that matter. So the first thing is we have to figure out what information we want to read. What's the beginning of it? And so as you can see in the little circle here, this is the information or the nodes that we're using to read the information that we want. In this case, we've selected an element inside of Revit and we want to know the parameter from the comment. So we're just basically reading the information that's in the comment from a family inside of Revit. Then we want to compute. So now we want to do something with that information that we read. So in this case, we're taking that comment and we're changing it from sentence case to uppercase. And the last thing that we want to do is we want to write. So now we want to take that information that we read, then we computed it, and now we want to write it. So with this simple graph, we've taken a piece of information from inside of Revit, we've performed an operation on it, in this case changing it to uppercase, and then we've pushed it back inside of Revit. So we were able to do that very quickly. Now in this instance, doing it with a single comment, probably quicker just to do it in Revit. But when we do it with 100 comments across an entire project, Dynamo is going to win hands down every time. It's more than just visual programming. So it's not just the idea that we have the ability to program visually. It's the fact that we're getting people that didn't go and get a computer science degree, that aren't coders, to take part and to change something in their software that they can't normally do by using this tool. So this is a quote from dynamobim.org. This is the original home to Dynamo. And the reason why it's dynamobim.org and not Dynamo is because Ian Keogh, the father of Dynamo, he was a big fan of Dynamo the magician. He's a European magician. So Dynamo BIM was born. And so as you can see here, it's open source. It allows you to go into Revit, manipulate data, to do all sorts of things that you want. And of course, now it's not just Revit that we can manipulate. And we'll see this a little bit further on. We can even take it one step further, and I really like this quote, is that it's really literally whatever you want to make it. So the idea that you have the ability to tweak it, to make it do things that you want, and that there's a large community of people out there that work with Dynamo that are creating packages, that are adding content, that are giving answers on forums and helping people improve their Dynamo skills. It really has taken on a life of its own, and it's become something that is more synonymous with the industry than it once was. It's no longer that if you go to a conference and there's one Dynamo class, it's more if you go to a conference and there's 60 Dynamo classes. It's really become something that people are aware of and that more people want to learn. If not to be the person in the office that's running Dynamo, but to understand what it does, what it can do, and to make sure you have people in your office that can understand and run Dynamo. Now, some of the things that we can do when we're working with Dynamo is not just working with the visual programming. So it is built off a language called DesignScript. And it's called DesignScript because it was purpose-built by Autodesk in their Shanghai office to be something that designers can use. Hence, DesignScript, which means it's meant to be human readable, very easy with syntax, so it kind of makes sense. And so if you can see on here, we sort of see the information that comes out of that and the way that we would put it inside of code block. If you haven't done any sort of coding, it still might be a little bit foreign to you, but the idea is that we're able to code directly inside of the software if there's a node that doesn't work for us. We also have the ability to use Python. Python is the most popular and the quickest growing coding language in the world right now. And so we have the ability that if we have a little bit of Python coding chops, or if you went to your local community college and took some Python, that we can take that and we can translate it into what we do in Dynamo and again improve our environment. Now, directly inside of it, it uses something called IronPython. So IronPython is essentially something that's written on top of C#, which is what Revit and Dynamo is built upon. So it allows us to code directly inside of it. Now, something to be aware of with these new versions that are coming up, the most recent version of Dynamo is 2.8 in the sandbox. I don't want to go down that road too far. We'll talk about it a little bit later. But some big news is that we are looking to phase out IronPython, which runs off 2.7, and coming into CPython 3, which means that we'll be able to work with the latest version of Python, which is 3.5 or 6 right now, no longer working on a version of Python that's about 10 years old. So for those of you that are working with Dynamo and working with Python, that's huge news that we're able to do that. And in the most recent sandbox, or runtime core as it's called, which is 2.8, we can actually do this right now. And as they move forward closer to a release of 3.0, it's going to become the default version. We're no longer going to be working with the old IronPython. We can also do zero-touch nodes. And for anybody that's done add-ins inside of Revit or done some other programming, you're probably familiar with C#. It's a very popular language, especially for coding. We can do what we call zero-touch nodes, which allows us to actually program inside of Dynamo using C#. So there's lots of ways with which we can improve that Dynamo experience over and above working with just the out-of-the-box nodes. But don't be intimidated. You don't have to be a coder, and you don't have to do any of those things. You can use the out-of-the-box nodes and be fine, but you're no longer limited to the out-of-the-box nodes. And of course, we can't forget Dynamo Player. So Dynamo Player allows us to run graphs inside of Revit without ever opening up Dynamo. And again, as I mentioned earlier, not everyone has to be an expert at Dynamo in your office or in your firm. We just need those people that are passionate about it, that are keen, those that want to do it because it's kind of fun. The same people that want to model new families inside of Revit because it's fun. To put together those graphs, put them in a folder, and then we can access them through Dynamo Player. And it's called Dynamo Player because it's modeled off of an MP3 player that you can literally just hit the play button and it runs for you. And in newer releases, you can see that it also gives you the ability to interact with the graph. When it first came out, it was kind of a run and done. You hit the button and it ran. If something happened, you really couldn't do anything about it. Well, now we have the ability to interact with things that we would interact with in the Dynamo environment directly inside of Revit. So again, if you happen to have a script about adjusting those points inside the ceiling that we saw earlier in the Revit tip, we can now put that in Dynamo Player and everyone can take advantage of that graph without having to actually open up and go inside of Dynamo to do that. So a quick recap about what we've covered. So it's a live programming environment, so you can get instantaneous results if you want. Keep in mind that can also be a bad thing, so I always recommend running in manual mode. It's understandable. It's easy to see what's going on as you're putting it through. We're not working with syntax. And again, easy is a relative term. It's compatible. Whether you want to work in textual, meaning that we can have code blocks and type text in, or we want to work in visual. We like to see the things plug in the wires and the nodes. We can do that. And it's extendable. We can take information from Dynamo and push it out into other platforms, whether that be Revit or Format or exporting to Excel. We can take the information from Dynamo and put it in other spots. And to sort of give you an idea of what that looks like with an actual graph, so it's immediate. As soon as we put this information from a CSV file into Dynamo, we see those points charted on a graph instantaneously. It's understandable. We understand that those XYZ coordinates are exactly that. And when we see the graph, we understand that we're at 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and where they are based off a simple XYZ coordinate system. We have the ability, you can see that this is coming from an actual CSV file. So all of the data as ones and zeros is stored in a CSV file that we're reading off of our hard drive, having it transposed, and then seeing it visually inside of our Dynamo environment. And again, the fact that it came from outside, or we could also write it to outside, means that we're not trapped with just the sandbox that is Dynamo. So how do we get started? We went through a lot there to sort of what is it at a high level, but how do we get started? If we've never used Dynamo before, how do we get into it? Well, let's look at the timeline. And as we can see, we see right at the beginning, Ian Keogh started sort of coming up with this idea that there has to be a better way and that we need something like Grasshopper that interacts with Revit, which was his program of choice back in the day. So almost 10 years old now. In 2011, he started working with it. Autodesk Labs, Revit, if any of you are on the call, remember Project Vasari, which was the predecessor to Format. Awesome little tool. Dynamo plugs into Vasari and the rest is history, as they say. It becomes a default part of Revit in 2015. Dynamo Studio and Dynamo Primer. Dynamo Studio is no longer around, but it was a paid version of Dynamo back in the day. Dynamo Player. The big jump from 1.0 to 2.0 where we changed to a JSON format, which was game changer for the back-end programming. Last year, we integrated with things like Civil 3D, Format, Advanced Steel, and Alias. And now in 2020, it's all about performance and speed and improving the reliability and what we can do with it as we work towards the 3.0 release, which will likely be the end of this year, early next year. So a lot of us here, in some way or another, work with Revit. So we can use Dynamo inside of Revit. But this is where it starts to get a little bit wonky. So when we work with Revit, we're allowed to have the current version 2021 and 3 versions back, 2020, 2019, and 2018. Well, there's different versions of Dynamo for each version of Revit. So currently, if you're working with 2018 or 2019, you can use version 1.3.4 or 2.0.4. I know, why is there a 1 and a 2? Well, basically the 1.3.4 is the last of the old school. The 2.0.4 is the new school. If you're starting from scratch, always, 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 please, always start with a version 2 program. You can move from a 1 point whatever graph up to a 2 point whatever graph. It's not always seamless, but it can be done. You cannot go back. In 2020, Dynamo became part of Revit in that when they push out updates to Revit is the only time you can get updates to Dynamo. Pre-2020, you would go to the Dynamo website, download the latest version, and install it yourself, which meant that all across your firm, different people had different versions of Dynamo, and it became a real nightmare for installations. So that also means with each version of Revit, we have a different version of Dynamo. So the most current version of 2020 is version 2.3. The most current version of 2021 is 2.6.1. If you can work on the most current version, you want to work on the most current version because you have better functionality. And just if that's not confusing enough, we also have the Dynamo Sandbox. So the Dynamo Sandbox is also called the Runtime Core if you go to download it, or the headless version of Dynamo if you want. But that essentially means that it doesn't have to tie it into anything. So to use Dynamo for Revit, I have to open Revit to access Dynamo. For the Dynamo Sandbox, I can open it and do whatever I want inside of it without attaching to Revit. The only thing I lose are the nodes that tie directly to Revit because, well, it's a standalone version. But it's also where you're going to find the latest and greatest information, as you can see, version 2.8 as opposed to version 2.6. If that's not enough, we need to find ways that we can learn. And one of the best resources for learning is actually going to the Dynamo website and going to dynamobim.org/learn. There's a ton of great videos in there. They were all just recently redone for the 2.0 version by John Pearson, or 60 Seconds Revit, as you may know him from Twitter, who is a Dynamo genius and so awesome with the community with answering questions on the Dynamo forum. So you couldn't have had a better person redo those videos. He was also instrumental in working on the new version, the 2.0 version of the Dynamo Primer, which basically goes through and explains how to use Dynamo. The biggest controversy about it is whether we call it a primer or a primer. I'm on Team Primer. They've also recently come out with a Dynamo dictionary. Again, open source, so you can add content to it. But the idea behind the Dynamo dictionary is that they're working their best to document each single node that comes with out of the box Dynamo. And that's one of the biggest questions that I get is, how can I use Dynamo if I don't know what node X does or node Y does? So now we can go look up those nodes. It explains what it does in layman's terms. It gives you an example of what it does, and typically there is a video or a GIF to explain it. And it also gives you a downloadable file so that you can actually test out what it does on your own system. So I highly recommend taking a look at the Dynamo dictionary. The other biggest thing is just play with it. You have to actually use it. Open it up, test it, probably not in a live project, but don't worry about breaking anything, just go crazy. And it becomes much easier if you have an actual problem to solve. Now, what do I mean by that? It's one thing to follow an example or a tutorial or a YouTube video. It's something completely other that if there's a problem you have to solve and you think Dynamo can do it, how do I do that? And what it does is it engages your brain because you actually think through the entire problem instead of just reading it off of the screen. And you just think differently about it. And it's really the best way to get engaged and to learn any new software or process. And of course, you can't forget the Dynamo forum. The Dynamo forum is your best spot to get answers. People all around the world use it, so there's people on there 24/7. A little tip, If you go to the Dynamo forum and say, hey, I'm working on a particular graph, I've got this far, share the graph, share a screenshot, but I'm stuck here. Can someone help me out? You're going to get help. If you go on the forum and say, hey, I have a deadline at 5 o'clock. I heard Dynamo can fix my problem. Can you do it? Likely not going to get help. Although the people on there are so awesome, you might get help anyways, but that's not the way to go about it. And of course, we talked about how now Dynamo isn't just Revit. So now we see that we work with Civil 3D, Advanced Steel, Format, and it's technically Format Pro, Alias Design, and Revit. You can also see different versions of Dynamo sit inside of each one. So a lot to keep track of. If you have used it in the past, since 2020, in fact, the library's got much better, but I have a package that even improves that. They're no longer standalone. So as I said, with 2020, they come installed. Every time you get that little update that says Revit 2020.1 update is out, that's the only time they can update Dynamo. And of course, Dynamo Studio is gone. It's now called Dynamo Core Runtime. Everyone just calls it the sandbox. So you don't have to be a programmer. All right, so what does Terry Tate have to do with Dynamo? Well, you don't have to be a programmer, but it helps. And the coffee analogy comes from a BIM Thoughts episode way back when Bill explained programming and the fact that you have to think about it logically in a coffee metaphor, as my lovely Tim Hortons cup here shows. And so that's always stuck with me, and it's always helped me in my process. So I always like to use this in my demonstrations, and if you have seen any of my classes, I use this in a lot, so bear with me. But the idea is, do you drink coffee? Well, if the answer is no, easy, we're done, move on. But if you do drink coffee, how much coffee is in that pot? Remember, we have to think about every single step, and when we're programming, whether it's visual or not, we have to accommodate for every step, every possible outcome. So there's none. Well, that's easy enough. We know we make a new pot. We're off to the races. Half full. Again, we're also all right because there's enough to fill up my cup. I fill up my cup, I carry on. Now this is where it starts to get tricky. What happens if there's only some? Well, we know that we can fill our cup, but judging after what we just saw from Terry, we also know that we have to make some more. Otherwise, we're going to be in trouble. Now, what if it's a full pot? It seems like a no-brainer to start, but again, we have to really think this through. What happens if it's leftover from yesterday? So it's not, all right, we can just take it. But what if it is? Do we have time to make a new pot? Sure. See the make new pot routine and we're off to the races. We don't have time to make a new pot? Well, we go to the microwave and we carry on. But you can see it's a little more complicated than just do you drink coffee, and that every outcome has a possible follow-up outcome or reaction. And so this is the way that we need to think when we're working with Dynamo. Now, the other thing that comes into mind when working with this, and if any of you have ever seen a XKCD comic, they're brilliant, is that sometimes we think it's a better solution than it really is. You know, I spent a lot of time doing a task, I'm gonna write a program. Look at that. Look at all the free time that I'm gonna have on my hands because I wrote this program. But then reality creeps in. And now I spend so much time trying to work on that program that I don't have any time for that original task. So Dynamo is great, programming and coding is great, but it's not always the answer. In the data set that I hand out, spoiler alert, I do a process where we go through and we create an entire hockey rink using nothing but Dynamo inside of Revit. And it takes about an hour. When I teach that and we go through the process and it takes about an hour, at the end of it, I ask everyone in the class if they think they could have done it quicker in Revit. Everyone's hand goes up and everyone says, yeah, I could have done that in Revit in 5 minutes. And that's the whole point of the exercise. I mean, aside from learning a little bit of Dynamo knowledge, it's not always the answer. So sometimes you have to know when it is and when it isn't. And if you go through that process and you learn that it wasn't the answer that time, well, that's not wasted time, that's knowledge for next time. The XKCD comics are funny. I love them. And usually there's a joke attached to them. But this particular one is actual hard concrete numbers that help with that. How much time should I spend on something? And this graph actually tells you that how much time you can spend versus how often you do the task to do that. So you can see that if you spend 1 hour a day on something and you do it once a month, then you can spend 2 days to program that, and it makes sense. So it just gives you a high-level idea of how much time you should spend to do something. Here's a quick example of what Dynamo looks like, and we're going to put a pin in that because if we get through all these slides, I want to show you a few things in the actual Dynamo environment. So now we're going to take a quick look at the user interface. So this is what Dynamo looks like now when you fire it up inside of Revit. And so we've got some things, a menu bar, toolbar, very familiar to any Autodesk programs you might use. Workspace. The library is a big one. That's where all of your nodes are kept. Of course, we have the ability to zoom in and out. We have our graph. That's number 6. That's the important part. And the execution bar, number 8. If you look down at number 8 and you see it's set to automatic, that's the part that it helps to put on manual when you're working so that a graph isn't always running. Sometimes when you get into a very complicated graph, you can get stuck into a loop where you can't do anything because it's changing information while it's trying to do information while it's changing information, and so on and so on and so forth. So by putting that in a manual mode, you can get to control when it runs. Everything's about the nodes and the wires. The nodes are the boxes, the wires are what connects them. It's just that simple. Now, the node itself or the interface has changed a little bit over the course of time. The most current iteration is what we see here. We're pretty close to what we see here. There is one small change, but we have the name. We have the inputs, the outputs. Inputs always on the left, outputs always on the right. We have our default and number 7 where it says default value. The other thing that changed in the most recent version that they just released with Revit 2021.1 is that anything that has a predefined default, which means a default that's already input, is in italics. So in this particular example, list would look like it would, but the amount would be written in italics. And by seeing something that's written in italics, you know that there's a default that's already implied, meaning that I don't have to put something in that. There's already something there. All the different states that we can run into. This is another thing that sometimes gets people a little weary when they're working with Dynamo and they start seeing nodes that look different. So what happens? How does it work? So the first one is active. So once we have a node that has been satisfied, the top turns gray. When it's inactive, meaning that it's not satisfied, so in this case, the X, Y, and Z needs information that's not there, it turns light gray. If we have an error, that means something wrong. And a lot of times people confuse error with warning. So warning is just below that, it's yellow. Warning means that there's something that's not right, but it doesn't mean it didn't work. We do get that in Revit all the time. You get a warning, the line's slightly off axis, you carry on. It's just telling you, but you know that you can carry on. The same thing can happen in Dynamo with those yellow ones. And as you see over the yellow one and the red one, there's that little balloon bubble. Well, that's information. Please click on that and read what it says. We can freeze. And so if we freeze a node, that means whatever it's supposed to do doesn't happen. So that gives you the ability to control the graph and also get a little horsepower back. Anything that's selected, you'll see there's that nice little blue ring around it so you know where it is. And the last one is preview off. And what preview off does is a little bit different than freeze. Preview off means that if this particular node puts a point at 0, 0, 0, like it shows there, that point won't happen because I don't want to preview it in the background. So these are all the different things that you might see on a node when you're working inside of Dynamo. We talked about the wires, 2 options. The top one, the curves are the most common, but some people really like things in a straight line, so we can do polylines as well. And then we bring it back to the library and get a little more in depth because you're going to spend a lot of time in the library. So there's the library and a library. So as you can see, geometry is a library, a subset of the library. We have our category. We have our queries. And if we look back, just because I went through this a little bit quickly, you can see that we have those 3 different categories. We have the plus for create, the lightning bolt for action, and the question mark for query. And then, of course, we have the node itself. So those are the bits and pieces that you'll see. And if you're working in an older version, so pre 2.0, it's going to look a little different than that, but the idea is the same. The other thing that's very important, and this plays into my tips and tricks that we talk about later, is graph management. Some ways that we can make sure the graph looks right when we're working our way through. So one of them is we can align things. There's tools within Dynamo to allow us to align stuff and put into place. We can add notes. So as you can see, it says original node name Boolean. So we can add information so that if you're not the one that's working with the graph, or not the one that made it, you can understand, or, and this happens a lot, you don't use the graph until 6 months later, you remind yourself what you were thinking at the time. We can group things together and color code them. And we even have the ability to quickly clean up our nodes so that they look presentable. They're not a stream of consciousness. They're put in a certain way where anyone can use them later on down the road. And a couple of quick slides just to show you things that are different between a 1.3 and a 2. Whatever version. And again, if you have the possibility, if you're starting from scratch, please use a 2. Whatever. And if you're working with Revit 2020 or above, it's only 2. Whatever. So as you can see, the library looks a little bit different. The nodes look a little bit different. And the biggest thing is that it's built on JSON instead of XML. And if you're not doing any coding, you can just leave that on the side. But for those that do coding, JSON is a much more user-friendly backend and much more popular, which means you have more people that are programming in it and more people that can use it. So now let's take a look and take a quick minute to talk about packages. So packages are ways that we can take information that's been created by other people, nodes, workflows, and we can use that inside of Dynamo. So again, it's talking about the community. It's about having other people being part of that process. And we do that through the package manager. And we can do this using that website online. We can download the content, search for something, select it, it tells us all the information. We can also do this directly inside of Dynamo itself by going to the package, saying search package, and then look for it. If you're just getting into Dynamo the first time and you open up 2021 and you go into Dynamo and you search for a package and you go, wow, this is kind of slow. Trust me, it is much, much faster than it used to be. And again, that's part of the speed and performance we're always working on. The other thing that comes into play is that when there used to be, 10 or 15 packages, now there's, thousands of packages up there. So sorting takes a little bit longer now too. We also need to manage those packages, which is where are they stored? Who's got access to them, where they are. And this is a whole other conversation and topic for those that have to implement and support Dynamo within a firm. But essentially we can see where they are and we can install and uninstall and what version of the packages. Also very important as we're working our way through. Some of the essential packages, packages that if you're just getting into Dynamo, I highly recommend you download. So again, we're back at the package manager, and this particular slide I took 2 hours ago. So this is the most current information. So you can see that there's almost 3 million packages have been installed since the package manager came out. We've got almost 1,500 packages and just short of 900 authors. And the most installed are, of course, some of the essentials, but I sort of cherry-picked my favorite from that list. So Archilab by Conrad Soban, it's a great package, all sorts of general Revit useful content. Clockwork by Andreas, also very important, and make sure you get the right one. As we saw back here, there's a 2x and 1x, and there's also a 0.6x and a 0.7x and a 0.9x. So you want to make sure you get the right one for the version of Dynamo that you have. Data Shapes by Mustafa, another good one. They're all good, that's why they're on the essential list. Data Shapes allows you to do a lot of things, most notably known for the ability to have pop-ups within Dynamo and Revit. So that first iteration of the Dynamo player that came out, you didn't have any way to interact with the content. Data Shapes gave you that ability to do that. It also allows you to brand your packages and your pop-ups. If there's one way that you want to get some ROI, you need to sell spending some time learning Dynamo to your company. Show them what you can do with data shapes where you can brand your graphs with the company logo. Guarantee you get approval. And the last two are both from John Pearson. Again, 60-second Revit. Highly recommend everything that this gentleman does. But Monocle is an extension, kind of like an add-in for Revit, whereas Rhythm is a package, which means that it's nodes. Both of them very awesome packages. So much so that if I was stranded on a desert island and I only had a single package or extension, it would always be Monocle first. And essentially, these are some of the things that it allows you to do, but some of the highlights, you see down in the bottom right corner what we call Doji or Doggy. It tells you which packages are in the graph. I can't tell you how helpful that is, especially when you've been away from the graph for a while. It also allows you to automatically label them, meaning that if this package comes from Clockwork and this package comes from Archilab, you say custom annotate it and it notes them for you. It also has a built-in Clippy from Word that tells you what your packages are, which is very nice. And probably the nicest new thing is it's improved the search functionality. So the out-of-the-box search inside of Dynamo is good. The improved search that John has come up with is much, much better. Now, a package that we'll see when I hop into the demo, if we have time, is called Dyna Standard. And what this does is it allows you to keep all of your Dynamo stuff in one spot and easily access it inside of the platform. So if you have a Dynamo standard, similar to think of it to a BIM execution plan, you can access that from within Dynamo. If you have a library where you store all of your company graphs, you can access that from within the library. If you have templates, and we'll talk about templates in a moment, you can access that from within there. It even gives you the ability to store a Python template so that if you're working with Python, you can have one sort of half-baked and ready to go when you're in there. If you really like packages and want to see more, as I mentioned earlier, I did a session May 26th with Yordesk University where I spent a whole hour reviewing, walking through those packages, showing them what they can do. And there's a YouTube video there. Feel free to go take a look if you want to get a little deeper into packages. And here are a bunch of other packages that are worth mentioning. Some of them are repeats. You'll also notice that we start with 0. You'll find that everything in Dynamo is 0 indexed, which means it starts at 0, not 1. So those are 27 packages that are definitely worth taking a look at. So now we're going to take a look at why Dynamo. And one of the first things we want to do with our tips and tricks is, first off, just do it and have some fun while you're doing it. So this is a great quote, and I think it fits perfectly in the sentiment here. Any significantly advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And it may seem like that, but once you learn the secret behind the trick, then it's not magic anymore. And hopefully, after doing some of this and listening to it with you, you don't think that Dynamo is magic anymore. Although maybe you can fool some people once you get good. Another thing that we have here is that little bit of fun. So what we have here is a code block with a simple range built into it. And so a range essentially means that we type in 3 things. So the A in quotations is where we want to start the range. The pound sign, or in this case, number sign, 2000 means how many steps there's going to be in that range. And the final number of -1 is what's the distance between each step. And just looking at that, you probably don't know. I know I certainly didn't know what this was going to give me. And this was a fun tip that came from Zach Crone, which is, again, another godfather in the Dynamo world. But essentially what it does is it's saying, I want to go through the alphabet, starting at A, and I want you to do 2,000 characters, and I want to do it in reverse. But what it's doing is it's going through the programmatic language for the alphabet. And it's not just A to Z in capitals and lowercase, but it's Aramaic, it's Wingdings, there's 1,422 different characters, and they're all listed in reverse order. What's the value in that? Well, probably not a lot, But you had a little bit of fun looking at windings on the screen. You learned how to do a little bit of code blocking. You learned what a range was, and you learned how to put it in there. And all of that while enjoying yourself as you're going through. That's a big part of it. If you're having fun while you're doing it, you're going to come back to it. If you're not, you won't. So keep it fun. Have a purpose, get to the goal, but have a little fun while you're doing it. Use a template. This is another pro tip, if you will. And we've seen some of this before, but a template might look like this. And a template can be a couple things. For most people, it's going to be a graph, so a DYN, that when you start a new graph, you begin with that template, and it has information like this in there. So it allows you to put information, who made it, when they made it, what's the purpose, and we can group things based on a color. When people see that color, they know this is an output or an input or something to that matter. So it allows you to organize your graphs. And again, you always want to be thinking about the next time you're going to be using the information, and more importantly, the next time somebody who isn't you, that didn't make the graph, is going to be using the information. And this is what a program might look like, or a graph might look like, that was used created with a template. You'll also see that some people will actually create it as a DYF, which is a definition, which means they can always reuse it over and over again. Something else that comes in very handy, and we're getting a little more advanced here, but if you're going to be spending some time inside of Dynamo, learning about list at level is going to make your life much, much easier. Now, this is a compressed cheat sheet from Marcello Scambolori, and any of you that have ever seen any of Marcello's AU or built classes, he's a big fan of the cheat sheet. It's a great format. But this basically came from a podcast that him and Colin McCrone did, who came up with the list at level, or helped implement it at least, I should say, to explain it. And the best way that I've heard it explained, as we sort of see here, is we always start at 0, so you need to remember 0 indexing. But the way to think of that is to look at your finger. So hold up your hand. And when you look at your hand, there's 5 digits. And you'll see on the list that Colin is 0, Marcel is 1, Jason is 2, John is 3, and Carl is 4. But when you also look at your hand, you know that there's only 4 fingers. The thumb isn't a finger, so the thumb is 0, finger 1, finger 2, finger 3, finger 4. So now the numbers make sense, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And this tries to show you how the list at level works. And you can see that list at level allows you to choose how far down the rabbit hole, if you will, you want to go. And you can see that if I go at level 3, it's the basest information. There are 5 things. So there are 5 people in that list. If I go to level 2, the intermediate level, you see that there are in fact 5 groups inside that list. So each list that's embedded in the list has 2 things, a first and a last name. Colin McCrone, Marcel Scambolori, Jason Boring, John Pearson, and Carl Storms. So that shows that there's 2 pieces of information in each list inside of that. And then if we go to level 1, we've drilled all the way down to the farthest bottom part of our information. We see that we have the ability to see that there's 1 piece of information in each one of those 10 lists now. Or if we go down a little bit further and keep the structure, we see that there's 1 piece of information in each group of those lists. Again, getting a little deep there, but once you understand list at level, it's going to really help working with your processes and being able to go through. And from this little demonstration, it's certainly not going to drive it home, but I also have some resources in here that help out. So the original Dynamo blog post that speaks about it, the Dynamo Primer, which is an excellent resource, including sample files to really drive home what list at level is, the podcast, and then of course the original blog that image came from. All those are great resources to get into the list at level. And the last thing that I'll sort of talk about here before we see if there's any questions is learning a little design script. So we saw that early on, the idea that we were able to code directly inside of Dynamo. So design script is, I'm going to say, fairly easy to learn. I'm not a coder by any means, and so I always have to think when it comes to that, but the idea is that the syntax is easy. And once you've used it a few times, like range, you can pick that up to get a lot of information out of it without having to spend a lot of time learning it. And so these are some simple things that you can do with design script. We talked about number range, number sequence, strings. Basically, what I do here is I show you what it looks like using out-of-the-box nodes, and then I show you what it looks like if we use design script. And anytime you see that information that's in green with the 2 backslashes in front of it, that's how we add a comment inside of a code block. Good code is commented code, whether it's visual programming or not. So anytime you're doing something, by adding those 2 backslashes and adding a piece of information, not only does it help people down the road that are viewing your graph or your code, but it's going to help you again 6 months down the road when you come back into it and you go, what exactly was it that I was doing? That helps you put it into place. So remember, commented code, good code. Some great resources. So there are some manuals again. Remember, Autodesk made this language purpose-built for Dynamo. But if you don't want to read legalese type of things, and both of those language summaries are that, good information, a little bit dry, just head down to Solomore. He's now the product manager for Dynamo at Autodesk. But the way that he describes, and more importantly, the information that he shares on his GitHub about design script, that's the first place I would go to get more information about what we can and can't do with design script. So before I hop into a demo, I'm going to see if there's any questions here. So I'm just going to stop sharing just for a second here so that we can get back into the Zoom world and just see if there was any questions or comments that came through. Again, I apologize for there being no chat, but if we did have a question, just unmute yourself and holler. I'm hearing a lot of silence.
Doesn't look like we've got any at the moment, Carl.
All right.
Hey, Carl?
Yes.
This is Weston here. You mentioned earlier about upgrading to or phasing out of the Iron Python language.
Yes.
Do you have any recommendations on where to start looking at Python coding?
As far as learning?
Yeah, so I've been using Dynamo a fair amount recently, and there's certain things that I've been trying to do that the built-in nodes aren't able to do, as far as I can tell. So I'm looking into teaching myself Python to kind of progress a little bit further.
Absolutely.
I was just wondering if you have any recommendations on where to start.
So when it comes to Python in general, you can Google Python and find stuff anywhere. So the problem with that stuff is it's just general Python stuff. And knowing the general syntax and how it works is certainly helpful. But when it comes to what we're doing and what we're doing inside of Dynamo, the first place that I would look is in the Dynamo form under the Python section. A lot of interesting stuff there. The other 2 places that I would look is John Pearson. I seem to be saying his name a lot, but he did a really great what is Python in Dynamo sort of class at AU. I want to say last year, but it might have been the year before. It's all sort of melt together. But the reason why I mentioned that one specifically is because AU records their classes. So if you go to Autodesk University Online and search for John Pearson, that class comes up. And so not only does he have a really great way of explaining how to use and get you started with how you would use Python inside of Dynamo, but he has a great data set that comes with it. And again, you don't get really deep in creating stuff in class, but you learn the stuff you need to know to be able to do it in Python for Revit-based workflow. After that, you can Google and Stack Overflow is everybody Googles that for little snippets of code information and use that. So, but that class from John gives you just that little bit to understand how it ties in with Dynamo and Revit, and then from there, just Googling Python solutions is going to get you there. Soul also has a really great class floating around out there. I don't think it's recorded. I think it's a build class, but also ties into that. So, but that would be my first place to go is that the AU session that John did, because it gets you started with programming with Python in Dynamo specifically.
Perfect. No, thank you. That's a lot of good information on places to start.
See, once you get me started talking, I don't stop.
Excellent.
Any other questions? All right, here's silence. We're at the top of the hour. I might take a few more minutes and just walk through some of the things that I explained in PowerPoint land in demo version, and then we will wrap it up. But so I'm going to share my screen again and just show you some of that stuff that we were talking about in the demo environment. So, all right, so you should be able to see my screen here, and we see we've got Revit and we've got Dynamo open. I'm just going to go ahead and expand Dynamo on the screen. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a new graph, and just to kind of look at some of the things that we talked about. The first thing is that, yes, I have a lot more packages than just the ones I recommend. I'm a bit of a package hoarder. But the first thing that I'm going to talk about is Dyna Standard. And again, this is really becoming a favorite package for me because of what it allows me to do, especially if you are someone on the management side. Again, it's free. They just updated it about a month ago. And so if I click on this, the interface is a little different than we saw on the slide again from that update. So the first thing is you're able to put your Dynamo standard directly here inside of Dynamo. And so if I click on this, it's going to open, it's always on a different screen, but it essentially opens the PDF of what you want. In this case, I just have attached the actual PDF from them about how to implement and run the software. But if you wanted to put in there your Dynamo standards, that's where they would go and everyone would have access to them. We also have the library, and again, another cool way. So it's not just the idea of where your graphs are. That's easy enough to remember where it is and to navigate to you, but it's the way that it gives you access to those graphs. So again, if I click on the library, again, pops up on a different screen, but we see this dialog box that pops up. And so what it does is it gives me the names of all of the information. And say I select this one, and the naming convention that I have is made for Dynamo Player, DP to start. 134 is the version of Dynamo it was created in. RFA means it's for a Revit family, and then upgrade, that kind of explains itself. So if I extract the information, it extracts the information, and you'll sort of see, although it cuts it off here, the file name, this stuff wasn't input in the time to come in place. It tells me the last version it was saved in, and then it also tells me that I'm in a version newer than 2.0 and that this graph is older and that there may be some problems if I open that graph. So again, it gave me that information. And you can see after I extract the data, I do in fact have the ability to open that graph should I want. Now, if I come back down to something that I know is a little bit newer, you can see by my naming convention that is in fact at 2.5. I can say extract information. You can see that that note went away. You can also see that it knows which version of the packages that are in it were in, very helpful. And then I can just say open, and it opens up that graph for me. Now, since that graph was created or updated, you can see that something has happened. Now I'm in Revit 2021.1, and so that means I'm using Dynamo 2.6, so many numbers. But one of the cool things is that it gives you this workspace reference. So it tells me that one of my graphs or one of my nodes is out of date. You can see it's in yellow. It tells me which one, it says which version it is. And it was version 622, but I have, if I go to package, manage, I scroll down to rhythm. See a lot of packages. You can see that I have a version 2020.98, so the most recent version. So that's why things are out of sync. So this usually means that either I should go back and downgrade to the old version of Rhythm, or most likely the node has been updated or tweaked or changed a little bit, and I could just find the new version, put that in place, and I'm good to go. You'll also notice that with the 2.6 and I think 2.5 as well, that we now have this little thing that lets us know if a node file name has been changed. And you can see that I knew it was changed in the past, so I say original node name Boolean, but now if I hover over this, you can see that it always remembers the original name. So I would no longer have to add a node in here starting from, I know it's in 2.6, but I think it came out in 2.5. It tells me that, and then it gives me a description of what it does. So when I see that little yellow piece, I know that that node has been renamed. So that's some of the cool stuff that comes into play with that. The other thing about Dynamo Standard as well, we talked about templates. So if I just close out of this, I go into Dynamo Standard, I go to my Dynamo template, and you can see that I've got some different templates, and again, you can have several in here. So I go to my old Imagine It template, I click on that, and it starts a brand new project with that template. And so now I can begin working on my project with that template and information. So it's pretty helpful. And again, if I have a different template, I put that in place and it brings it in. Again, different pieces of information, different template. This one has some example files in it, but again, based on your project. I even have one in there for working with Civil 3D. So I have an example in there for when I'm working with Civil 3D. This package is in my Civil 3D installment and I can bring it in place and have it there. And the last thing I'll say about this is that we also have that Python. So Weston was talking about getting a little more into Python. This is really going to be helpful because it allows you to have a Python template. And essentially what that means is that if I go in here to script, editor, Python script. So now I have the Python node. And if I go in here and I say edit, this is what you get out of the box. So this is the basis of how I want to start working with my Python. But there's other things you need to do. Again, John references that in the class about how I have to pull in information from the Revit API and where's that stored. And so normally when you start a script inside of Dynamo for Python, there's a few extra lines that should be in there. It sucks having to start to type them in from scratch or open up Notepad and copy and paste. So what this does is I'm able to go in here, Python template, and I have a couple. So dialog box comes up, which one do I want to use? Do I want to apply this template to all Python nodes? I only have one, or just the one I have selected. Let's say just the one I have selected. Choose a template, say okay. And now if I go in here and say edit, you can see that there's a lot more information in there already. So this is all stuff that I would have had to have entered manually. Try to remember to enter. If I miss one letter, one number, one period, it's not going to run right. And so now I have this set up as a template. And I could also have several templates that already have the basis of what I want based into it, have them stored there, click my button, boom, I'm off to the races. So it really does kind of sort of help as you're working your way through to put that stuff in there. One of the other things that I want to show, and again, I don't mean to keep harping on the Dynamo standards, but it just makes my life a little bit easier. We talked about the design script. So if I go into here, I go to my library, and you can see one of the things I have is my design script examples. So I'm going to go ahead and extract information and open that. There we go. Took a while to open it, but now you can see. So now I have all of these pieces of information to sort of work with that design script. And essentially what I do is I go through the process of giving you a code block, and getting a code block is super easy, and most people will use this a ton because I simply just have to double click on the canvas and it brings up a code block. And then I can use a code block for pretty much anything. So it's one of those things that'll become second nature when you start working inside of Dynamo. So you can see, you know, I can put in a 5 text. So now I know how we work with information. Now, the other thing that you'll notice here that you may not have noticed in the slide is that we also now have in 2.6 numbering. And the first thing you say is, but Carl, you told me that everything inside of Dynamo is 0 indexed, and it is. If I hover over this and I go, you'll see where, let me get one that's got my list in it here. There we go. You can see that it starts at 0. My list starts at 0. My list starts at 0. What this is this is computer code, and it's telling about lines. So there's no 0 line. There's always 1. So a little bit confusing, but it does allow you, if you're copying and pasting from, say, Notepad++, it now looks exactly the same. Anybody that's doing a little bit of coding, all their lines are numbered. Now it's exactly the same. And again, that's new for 2.6 inside of Dynamo. So again, we've got a bunch of bits and pieces in here. This is in the data set that we have there to sort of help you learn your way through as we get into working with this in place. And the last thing that I'll talk about real quick before I see if there's any questions before we wrap up is, again, just talking about Monocle. So I'm going to start go back into new. I'm going to open up one of my graphs from here again, just to take a look at it. So I'm going to close out of this. And I'm just going to pretend like I didn't note any of these, just to kind of show you what it does. So if I open up Monocle, we can choose what we want to do. So again, we go into our package usage. Sorry. People were, and for those of you that know John, you know that, oh, I forgot about his Halloween one. That is so awesome. Sorry, I have to take a picture of that. But he likes to do things like this, which is put in an extra gift. So we've got the little Halloween dancer in there. Well, there were people that didn't appreciate that. They didn't think it was professional, and that maybe we shouldn't have that in our work environment. Although I'll say most people aren't going to see Dynamo. But hey, John's always wants to make sure that everybody's able to use his product and able to get through it. So now we have what he calls boring mode, which is the same thing. It just looks a little less exciting. So it shows us the package. We have the ability to annotate custom nodes. This is the only way we can send this information to clipboard, which is handy. But now I can say annotate nodes. It brings us into place. And now you can see it's annotated those nodes for us and put into place. Small thing, super handy. And last thing that makes life a little bit easier. So if I come back in here and I search, so I'm looking for Excel nodes. So it's getting better. I kind of got through some of that, but what we're able to do with John's tool is we can do simple search, pops up, and now I can say Excel nodes. So not only does it show me the name of the nodes very quickly, it gives me the full name. I can also get the description in here if I will. So it gives me the description. I can exclude custom packages, so I'm only looking for packages there. And you see how lightning fast this thing is? And his last little thing that he does with this as well is we also have the ability, as a beta feature, to override. So if I click this, it now overrides the original one. So so we just typed in geometry, all these options that I have, and how quick that was. So for those of you that are just starting, won't seem like a big a deal. For those of you that have been using it, you're going to run out right now and download the latest version of Monocle for two reasons. One, that search, and two, because that GIF is just too awesome not to be using. All right. I'm getting a little hoarse here, so I'm gonna stop talking and stop sharing. And I'm gonna ask once more if anybody has any questions. Otherwise, I will end the recording and say thank you for allowing me to be part of your evening.
Perfect. Yeah, so like Carl mentioned, if anybody has any more questions, now would be a perfect time. I don't myself, Carl, but I'd like to just thank you on behalf of SaskBIM and everybody in attendance for another excellent presentation. Dynamo is an extremely powerful tool with endless capabilities, as you've kind of shown here. I know I've got one thing particular I'm going to be digging into that I can work with in my Revit projects. I'm an infamously poor speller and typer, and that comes across on my professional documents. So I'm going to run some Dynamo scripts to help me out with some of that.
Awesome, and that'll certainly help because the out-of-the-box stuff in Revit isn't the best.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I got to
Alright.
say, Carl, that was a fantastic presentation. Pretty captivating. So really well done.
Thank you, Tyler. It's always good to hear, and it's always great to be invited to great user groups like SaskBIM. Happy to help whenever I can. As I mentioned, all of this data is in the in that data set, which you can get from screenshot, and I will share the PDF with the group as well, so they can disseminate it in their next email with everyone for those that couldn't attend, and they can also I'll give them access to the video so they can post it as well once we're finished. But with that,
That sounds awesome.
thanks so much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and until next time, keep dynamoing.
Thanks a lot, Carl.
Perfect.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
Carl.